Picture this. It's October 2024, and you're watching Russian President Vladimir Putin on stage in Kazan, Russia. In his hand, he's holding what looks like a banknote. But this isn't rubles or dollars or euros. It's something that could change the entire global financial system forever. The bill says BRICS across the top, and it represents a plan that's been years in the making. A plan to create an entirely new monetary system that could challenge the dollar's 80-year dominance over global trade. Utilizing nearly half the world's population and over 40% of global GDP, countries are teaming up and saying they've had enough of playing by America's financial rules, and they're building their own system to replace it. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. Most people have never heard of BRICS, but they should have, because this organization now represents 11 countries that control nearly half the world's population and more than 40% of global GDP. But here's the crazy part. BRICS didn't start as a political alliance. It started as a Wall Street investment thesis. In 2001, Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill coined the acronym BRIC for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. He was identifying them as rapidly growing economies that could challenge the dominance of the G7 wealthy nations. It was just supposed to be a catchy way to market emerging market investments. But something unexpected happened. These countries took the acronym and turned it into an actual diplomatic bloc. In 2006, the foreign ministers started meeting. By 2009, they held their first formal summit. In 2010, South Africa joined, creating BRICS. And then in 2024, everything changed. The group exploded in size. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates joined as full members. Indonesia became the 11th member in January 2025. And another 13 countries were invited as partner nations. We're talking about countries like Nigeria, Thailand, Malaysia, Turkey, and Vietnam. All of them looking for an alternative to the Western-dominated global financial system. Now, let me introduce you to the main characters in this story, because understanding who's involved explains everything about why this matters. China is the dominant force. They account for over 40% of BRICS GDP and nearly 70% of the coalition's total economic output. China sees BRICS as a way to challenge American financial hegemony and create a multipolar world where they're an equal player to the United States. Russia is the geopolitical driver. After their invasion of Ukraine, Russia became desperate for allies and trading partners. They view BRICS as a tool to escape the coordinated economic sanctions that the West has imposed on them. India is the cautious balancer. They want the benefits of BRICS membership, but they're not interested in completely abandoning their relationships with the West. India's foreign minister recently clarified that India has never been for de-dollarization, and there's no proposal to have a BRICS currency. Brazil is the diplomatic moderator. President Lula has been clear that BRICS is not a counterpoint to the G7, nor the G20, nor against anyone. They see it more as insurance against Western isolation than an anti-Western alliance. But here's where it gets really interesting. The new members bring serious economic firepower. With Iran, the UAE, and potentially Saudi Arabia, BRICS could control nearly half of global oil production. We're talking about the countries that literally power the world economy. Egypt and Ethiopia represent African expansion beyond South Africa. Indonesia brings Southeast Asia into the fold. These aren't small players. These are major regional powers with massive populations and growing economies. So what does BRICS say it's trying to achieve? Officially, they have three main goals. First, reform global governance. BRICS was founded on the premise that international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN Security Council are dominated by Western powers and don't serve developing countries. Think about it. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members with veto power: Britain, France, Russia, China, and the United States. 3 of those are Western allies. The World Bank has always been headed by an American. The IMF has always been headed by a European. BRICS countries look at this and say, Why should institutions created 80 years ago by the winners of World War II still control the global economy when we represent half the world's population? Second, economic cooperation. They've created the new development bank with $100 billion in capital to fund infrastructure projects. They've established a currency reserve pool worth another $100 billion. The goal is to reduce dependence on Western financial institutions. Third, alternative financial architecture. This is the big one. They're building something called BRICS Pay, a blockchain-based payment system that would connect member countries' financial systems without using the SWIFT system that's dominated by the dollar. Think of it as creating their own financial internet that bypasses American control. But here's what BRICS doesn't say publicly. The real problems they're trying to solve are much more fundamental and much more threatening to American power. The biggest issue is dollar dependency. Right now, about 59% of global currency reserves are held in dollars. Nearly 90% of all currency trading involves the dollar. Most international trade, especially in commodities like oil, is conducted in dollars. This gives America what's called exorbitant privilege. We can print money to finance our deficits, and the rest of the world has to accept it because they need dollars to trade with each other. But BRICS countries are tired of this system. A report by India's central bank stated that having foreign exchange reserves in an increasingly polarized world no longer seems a sufficient defense against the threat of economic sanctions. In other words, they're realizing that holding dollars makes them vulnerable to American financial warfare. The second major problem is sanctions vulnerability. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and its allies didn't just impose trade sanctions. They froze Russian central bank assets, kicked Russian banks out of SWIFT, and essentially weaponized the global financial system. This scared the hell out of other countries. China, Iran, North Korea. They all realized that if they ever crossed the United States, they could face the same treatment. Even countries that aren't hostile to America started asking, what if we have a policy disagreement with Washington? Could they freeze our assets too? The third issue is representation deficit. BRICS economies account for 37.3% of global GDP based on purchasing power parity, while the United States and European Union each account for roughly 14.5%. Yet the global financial system is still designed as if it's 1950 and the West controls everything. These countries want institutions that reflect current economic reality, not the power structure from 80 years ago. But before you panic about BRICS taking over the world economy, you need to understand the massive internal problems that could tear this alliance apart. The first issue is China's dominance. China is responsible for nearly 70% of BRICS' total GDP. This creates what experts call a hub-and-spoke arrangement, where every other country's relationship with China is more important than their relationships with each other. India and Brazil don't trade much with each other. South Africa and Russia have limited economic ties. It's really China plus a bunch of separate bilateral relationships rather than a true multilateral alliance. Second, there are massive geopolitical contradictions. Iran and Saudi Arabia are regional enemies who've been fighting proxy wars across the Middle East. Egypt and Ethiopia are in conflict over Nile water rights. China and India have been in a military standoff in the Himalayas for over 4 years. How do you build a coherent alliance when your members are literally at war with each other? Third, they have fundamentally different political systems. Brazil and South Africa are vibrant democracies. Russia is an authoritarian oligarchy. China is a one-party communist state. Iran is a theocratic regime. These countries don't just have different interests, they have completely different values and governance structures. Fourth, there's the practical implementation problem. BRICS has been promising a unified currency for years, but they keep pushing back the timeline. Their pledges to create new telecommunications networks never happened. Their trade agreements often exist only on paper. The gap between BRICS rhetoric and BRICS reality is enormous. Despite these internal problems, BRICS poses several serious challenges to American economic dominance that Washington can't ignore. The first threat is to dollar hegemony. BRICS accounts for a large part of global GDP and over 16% of world trade. If they successfully create alternative payment systems and start trading in their own currencies, it could gradually erode demand for dollars. This has already begun. Global dollar reserves have fallen from 72% 2 decades ago to about 59% today. China and Russia are increasingly trading in yuan and rubles. India is buying Russian oil with rupees. The second threat is commodity market control. The global commodity market is worth $1.7 trillion annually, and BRICS countries are major producers of oil, gas, grains, metals, and minerals. If they coordinate their commodity sales outside the dollar system, it could undermine what's called the petrodollar arrangement that's been a pillar of American financial power since the 1970s. The third threat is sanctions circumvention. Russia and Iran are already using BRICS relationships to evade Western sanctions. China provides technology and financing. India buys Russian oil. The United Arab Emirates facilitates trade. Brazil and South Africa provide diplomatic cover. This reduces the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool of American foreign policy. The incoming Trump administration clearly sees BRICS as a major threat. In December 2024, Trump posted on Truth Social, "We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs." 100% tariffs. That's essentially economic warfare. The Kremlin responded immediately. Spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, "If the US uses force, economic force, to compel countries to use the dollar, it will further strengthen the trend of switching to national currencies." But here's the thing. Despite all the scary headlines about BRICS challenging American dominance, the current reality is much less dramatic. First, de-dollarization is really hard. Most BRICS countries still conduct the majority of their international trade in dollars because that's what the infrastructure supports. When you want to exchange Indian rupees for Brazilian reals, you usually have to convert through dollars because there isn't enough direct trading volume. Even within BRICS, when Russia demanded that India pay for oil in Chinese yuan, India refused because they don't want to accumulate large amounts of yuan they can't easily use. Second, many BRICS countries have dollar-denominated debt. If they abandon the dollar system, they still need dollars to service their existing debts. This creates a practical constraint on how quickly they can move away from dollar dependence. Third, their currency alternatives aren't ready. The BRICS pay system is still under development, according to Brazilian officials. The proposed BRICS currency doesn't exist. Even the blockchain-based payment systems they're building are years away from being functional alternatives to SWIFT. Even the guy who created the BRICS acronym thinks it's a failure. Jim O'Neill, the Goldman Sachs economist who coined the term, wrote in 2021 that BRICS countries have so far proven incapable of uniting as a meaningful global force. Academic experts are similarly skeptical. Warwick McKibben and Marcus Noland of the Peterson Institute for International Economics agree that the BRICS pose no serious threat to the dollar's dominance. The fundamental problem is that BRICS members want the benefits of coordination without giving up their sovereignty. They want alternatives to American-dominated institutions without creating truly independent alternatives that might constrain their own freedom of action. But even if BRICS isn't an immediate threat to American financial dominance, it represents something important that policymakers need to understand. This is about legitimacy. For 80 years, the global financial system has been built around American leadership. Most countries accepted this because America was the largest economy, the most stable democracy, and generally used its power responsibly. But that consensus is breaking down. America is still the largest economy, but not by as much as it used to be. China's economy is now about 70% the size of America's and growing faster. India will soon have the world's largest population. Brazil, Indonesia, and Nigeria are all major regional powers. These countries don't want to destroy the global financial system. They want to reform it to reflect current realities rather than the power structure from 1945. BRICS is less about creating an anti-American alliance and more about creating options. It's a hedging strategy. Countries want alternatives, so they're not completely dependent on American-controlled institutions. While the BRICS currency gets all the headlines, the real action is in payment systems. China, Russia, India, and Brazil have all created alternatives to SWIFT. There's something called Project mBridge that connects central bank digital currencies from multiple countries. These systems are still small compared to SWIFT, but they're growing rapidly. And once they reach critical mass, they could provide a real alternative to dollar-dominated international payments. This is where the United States is most vulnerable. Not to a new BRICS currency, but to gradual erosion of the dollar's role as the universal medium of international exchange. The United States has two basic options for dealing with the BRICS challenge. Option one is resistance. Threaten tariffs, impose sanctions, use economic coercion to force countries to stay in the dollar system. This is essentially Trump's approach. The problem with this strategy is that it validates everything BRICS countries say about American financial hegemony. If you have to threaten countries to use your currency, maybe your currency isn't as attractive as you think it is. Option two is reform. Acknowledge that the global financial system needs updating to reflect current economic realities. Give emerging economies more voice in institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Create more flexibility in the international monetary system. This is harder politically because it requires giving up some American privilege, but it's more likely to preserve American leadership in the long run. Here's my assessment of where BRICS stands and what it means for the future of money. BRICS is simultaneously more important and less coherent than most people think. It represents genuine dissatisfaction with American financial dominance and poses real long-term challenges to the dollar's global role. But it's not a unified alternative to the Western-led system. It's more like a collection of countries that want options and flexibility rather than dependence on any single power, including China. The biggest threat isn't that BRICS will create a new currency that replaces the dollar overnight. The threat is gradual erosion of dollar dominance as countries build alternative payment systems, trade more in local currencies, and reduce their dependence on American financial institutions. This process could take decades, but it's already begun. The question isn't whether the dollar's dominance will endure forever, because it won't. The question is how long it can hold up and what comes next. For individual investors, this means diversification becomes more important. Don't put all your wealth in dollar-denominated assets. Consider exposure to other currencies, commodities, and real assets that maintain value regardless of which monetary system dominates. For policymakers, it means the United States needs to think carefully about how to maintain influence in a multipolar world rather than trying to preserve a unipolar system that's already changing. The future of money might not be Bitcoin, it's probably not a BRICS currency, it's probably a world where multiple currencies and payment systems coexist, with no single country having the kind of monetary dominance that America has enjoyed since World War II. And maybe that's not be a bad thing. Competition in monetary systems, like competition in markets, tends to produce better outcomes for everyone. The dollar became the world's reserve currency because it was stable, reliable, and backed by the world's largest economy. If America wants to maintain that role, it needs to keep the dollar stable, reliable, and competitive with the alternatives that BRICS and other countries are building. The future of money is about choice, competition, and adaptation. The countries and currencies that provide the most value to users will win, and that's exactly how it should be. Thank you for watching My Money Mint. I'd love any feedback you have for my videos.